Hello, everyone, and welcome to the event. My name is Linda Samuels, and I am a faculty member at the Sam Fox School here at Washington University in St. Louis. I teach urban design and architecture. My specialty here is in systems-based urban design thinking. So I teach in our Masters of Urban Design program and our Doctor of Sustainable Urbanism program. And before I was here at WashU, I was the director of the Sustainable City Project at the University of Arizona. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our event today, and we are so excited to have you all, including our newest graduates. So welcome, family, friends, alumni, faculty, and students from WashU. I also want to do a quick little plug. I've just completed a book, and I'm hoping that all of you will take a look and take it back to your respective colleagues and peers, called Infrastructural Optimism. And I think Sam's program that you will hear about today is a real in practice version of one of my definitions of infrastructural optimism, which is leveraging investment for greater social and environmental gain. And I'm so excited to hear about this new Portland initiative. So on behalf of the WashU Alumni Association, I am honored to welcome all of you, again, alumni, parents, students, and friends, to this virtual event, Climate Justice and the Portland Clean Energy Fund with Sam Baraso, BSBA 08. After Sam's presentation, we will have time for questions. So I appreciate those of you who have already submitted questions when you pre-registered, but also feel free to add questions at any time to the Q&A function. If a question seems relevant while Sam is speaking, we'll include that, but we would prefer to sort of hold questions at the end. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. We'll be monitoring again the chat, the Q&A, and the questions you presented in advance. This is being recorded, so if you have colleagues or friends who weren't able to make it today, it will be available on the Alumni Association YouTube channel later this week. So now it is my pleasure to introduce and welcome alumnus Sam Baraso. Hi, Sam. Thank you so much for joining us. Sam leads the Portland Clean Energy Community Benefits Fund team in charge of implementing Measure 26201. That measure was approved by 65% of Portland voters in November of 2018. PCEF invests $44 to $61 million annually in new revenue for green jobs, healthy homes, and a climate-friendly Portland for all. Sam brings a wealth of government experience and community leadership to the effort, where he works closely with city staff, city hall, and frontline communities. Prior to his role at the city, Sam served as a senior policy advisor in Multnomah County's Office of Sustainability. Sam also serves on the state's Environmental Quality Commission, the board of Willamette Partnership, and previously served on the board of Imagine Black. So please join me in welcoming Sam. Thank you, Sam. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Linda, thank you for having me here. Again, my name is Sam Baraso, and I just want to really appreciate folks chiming in. I know that we're probably all getting really exhausted and ready to be back in person soon. So I hope at some point to be giving something like this in person with you all. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here in a second, and that'll take me hopefully just a second. But you know, as Linda mentioned, I get to lead a phenomenal staff that implement the Portland Clean Energy Community Benefits Fund. We tend to call it PSEF. And so I'm going to jump right in and just speak to a little bit of the background, what's happened, why it came about, as well as sort of just how it's working and what our initial and our first round of projects that we're getting the fund look like. And hopefully we'll talk a little bit about just how it may connect to national efforts and other things. So just at the start, what is PSEF? We're a city fund that invests in climate action that advances racial and social justice. As Linda noted, we were passed by 65% of Portland voters in November 2018. And this is the first climate fund measure created and led by communities of color. And so that's going to be a little bit of the history that I hope to speak to later on. But it took a little bit over 2 years of coalition building between organizations that represented communities of color within the city, as well as environmental organizations, as well as progressive business and labor, to come together and pull this ballot measure. But at the core, the leadership was by communities of color, with a lot of those other organizations and constituents bringing privileged capacity to the table. Now, when the fund is fully implemented, we're going to be spending out about $40 to $60 million annually for these investments, which I'll speak about in a little bit. And I mentioned this last bullet here, that the fund is funded by 1% gross receipts tax on sales by Portland corporations that make over $1 billion nationally and at least $500,000 locally. So a whole range of things that are exempt from that, such as groceries, utilities, medicine. But the reason I mention this is, unlike bonds, unlike levies, unlike other things that traditionally local governments and municipalities use to fund, those things oftentimes are short term. They may last for a few years, 2, 3, 4 years, 5 years. And similarly, unlike federal stimulus dollars, such as those that came through in the late 2000s, such as the American Recovery Investment Act, those tend to be short term. And so with this fund and the mechanism is a fund that is here into perpetuity. So it is a fund that keeps on giving, and unless we mess it up and Portland voters decide to recall the measure, it's here with us and here to stay. And so there's a tremendous amount of weight and importance to that, and it allows us to think a lot more holistically and long term in terms of our views and in terms of the sightlines we take in terms of the investments we make. Okay, in this next slide, I'm going to speak to a little bit about why and the whole range of recent events that are going to even bring this further to home. But the reason PSEF came to be is that there's been essentially a long history within the city, the region, around people of color and low-income people being most burdened by climate change and least connected to those clean energy opportunities. Nationally, Portland and Oregon have a reputation as being incredibly a green city and a green state, and yet we know, while there's a lot of truth to that, that reputation hasn't extended those benefits to people of color and low-income folks and many others. And at the same time, these are the same communities that have the greatest exposure to the greatest impacts from climate change and the least access to adaptation. This played out incredibly tragically here just a couple of weeks ago in late June, where we had our heat dome, which I think a lot of people picked up nationally, where temperatures within the Portland region hit over 116 degrees. And to give you that, we have at least 20% of our households without air conditioning units, which, depending on what part of the country you're in, that just everyone has AC or many people don't. But these are climates that are incredibly unheard of here, and it's tragic in that we lost over 100 lives to those extreme heat events. And most of those folks were alone, older, had pre-existing conditions, and could not get out of their homes to cooling centers and other places, or did not have actually any cover, any homes that could be cooled. So this is very real. It's very real. It's playing out certainly here and in many other parts of the state, but certainly those that are getting most exposed to those climate, whether it's wildfire smoke, extreme heat, cold events, flooding, certainly have the least access to adaptation. Our low-income residents are most, they're their energy cost burden. I think national average is something around 6 or 7% or so or that's the definition. Once you're paying over that of your annual income, that's when you're cost burden. And then our solar jobs, when we talk about a lot of our clean energy opportunities, I don't have the particular stats on how many rooftops have solar here, but it's a lot. And yet those jobs oftentimes are 80% going to men and about almost 90% going to white folks. In terms of non-residential construction, it's 96% male and 80% white. And yet within the city and the region, we have a 40-year plus history of energy incentive programs and tax credits that have been economically exclusionary, that have been towards the benefit of homeowners, the benefit towards those that have a tax obligation that they could take a tax credit for, or the benefit of those that could pony up and put resources in order to take advantage of resources. And so, and all of these resources have been coming from the public. These have been coming from whether tax resources or whether utility bill, whether they're a portion of utility bill that's taken to invest in these things. So these are things that everyone is paying for, yet a small subset of the population is getting the benefit from, and a substantial subset is not. So that long history, combined with a history of redlining and so many other things that we've been understanding and getting a deeper understanding and appreciation for, have contributed to communities of color, low-income folks, and many others being locked out of opportunities. And this map here that I just showed, it shows actually the historical redlining map. And so the only places that people of color could live were in the red areas within the map, and even those were further limiting depending on the particular titles and deeds. Okay. So how does PSEF actually work? We have a revenue division that collects the surcharge, and then our program operates within the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability within the city, and we issue requests for proposals. Our requests for proposals, the nonprofits have to respond. It is limited to nonprofit organizations, although they can partner with other nonprofits, governments, for-profits, and many others. They respond, and we have scoring panels ultimately review the proposals and evaluate them. The scoring panel members are comprised of staff, our committee members, which I'll speak to shortly, as well as technical experts. And then ultimately our full committee, which is pictured beautifully here, evaluates the proposals and ultimately makes the funding decisions. There's a lot of weight, and I'm just going to pause here to speak to who makes the funding decisions. There was a lot of weight that was placed in intentionality within the folks that drafted this ballot measure, that they wanted the initiative and those making the decisions or heavily informing them to be by and for the community. So our committee is majority. I think we have 6 out of 9 members that identify, or 7 out of 9 members identify as people of color, and it's majority women, and so much more. And I don't want to break them down just to those characteristics. They're phenomenally talented, and it's by far the best, one of the best committees I've had the fortune to work with. They ultimately get to nominate their replacements. They get to make recommendations to changes to the program, as well as make recommendations to on the funding to City Council. And this just takes the thinking that when if City Council wants to deviate from one of their recommendations, they have to publicly state why and detail why they're deviating. So there's a lot of weight that gets carried with the recommendations this 9-person body makes. And then City Council makes the approvals, and we go forth, we grant, we contract with these entities, and they get moving on their good work. This pie chart here captures just some of the funding areas that are eligible to be funded within the initiative. So the largest that you see here are clean energy programs. Now, these are things we typically think of when we think about energy, clean energy. These are your energy efficiency, renewable energy investments, your solar panels that are happening on commercial buildings, residential buildings, apartment buildings, as well as school buildings and industrial buildings. So these are sort of your building things, and this is whether we're going into a building and retrofitting it to make it more efficient and use less energy as it heats and cools up, or whether we're putting solar panels on top, and a whole array of other things. The next largest pool of funding goes towards contractor training and workforce development. What we mean here is that we recognize that as we are pouring this funding in, that as part of diversifying and making sure that the beneficiaries of these projects aren't just the people that are getting the solar panels or getting the more efficient heating systems, but that there are also those that are getting to lead and work on these projects. And we're talking about high wage jobs where starting, where someone on one of these jobs could be making $100,000 a year. So workforce development is about making sure we're training and diversifying and making sure there's more women, people of color, and folks with disabilities on these projects, as workers, getting to do the energy audits, putting insulation or doing some of the green infrastructure, as well as training and diversifying the contractors that are leading on these projects. So it's not just about the workers, but making sure that those workers are getting to work for firms where the ownership reflects them. And then the last couple buckets are green infrastructure and regenerative ag. That's 10 to 15%. This is about investing in things I tend to think about as planting in soils, getting green stuff in soils so that we're sequestering carbon into the soil. So it's a smaller percentage, but also just as relevant. And the last bucket, and so that's your street trees, your urban farms, your green roofs, your bioswales. And the last one is innovation. And those are just things that don't neatly fall within any one of these categories, but are otherwise reducing greenhouse gas emissions and advancing racial and social justice. And notably, what I'll say is absent here for folks that track climate closely is just transportation was noticeably absent. We anticipate funding that out of innovation, but we can get into that, and it's a more nuanced conversation, but I did want to acknowledge that. This picture here I showed just to capture and display sort of the diversity and variety of the types of projects that we can fund. Whether that is some of the street trees you see in the top corner, in the middle, you see folks coming together and planning their projects, or folks putting solar panels on a school building or apartment building, to folks working on the exterior, the envelope of a building and sealing it, making it more tight, planting plants, and as well as making sure that our workers have the appropriate wraparound services so they can get appropriately trained and be able to show up on their jobs and get to that level where they can get full-time jobs. There's a range of scoring criteria, which I can certainly get into when we get into the mechanics of this, and sometimes when folks want to go there. But I just really want to speak to something that was really important. That and there's always these trade-offs. We certainly evaluate organizations, the projects, the environmental benefits, but we're looking for bill savings that are going to accrue to people of color and low-income households. We want to make sure that folks are actually getting real, meaningful savings on their bills. So it means that it's more money going into their pockets, or their ability to just heat their homes appropriately at night or in the winter, or cool their homes so that someone can feel a little bit more comfortable, be able to do a little bit more homework or something else. So there's just a range of that, as well as making sure that, there's other things such as health benefits, that we're making sure homes are well ventilated so that we don't have mold, particularly, which is of concern in the Pacific Northwest, but we don't have mold. We don't have any maybe radon, and making sure. So there's other things that we look at as well beyond just energy efficiency, beyond sort of the strictly greenhouse gas emissions. And I'll just speak now to just a little bit of our inaugural funding cycle. And I think maybe I'm going to jump back to a few slides. In the bottom corner here, in our inaugural funding round, which we went out which we awarded in April of this year, we awarded about 8.6 million in funding. Truly consider this a beta round or beta year of funding. And this next year, we're gearing up for 60 million. So I'm going to share what that 8.6 million was. And it's a lot of information here, but I'll just give you a little bit of a flavor of what are we talking about when we talk about these projects. Now, we funded about 45 grants. About 86% of the funding went to organizations that reflect the populations they're serving. And those are priority populations. And so that means that the majority of their board, the majority of their senior leadership, and the majority of their staff reflect the community that they say they're going to serve. About 38% of our funding went to small organizations, those with 6 or less full-time equivalent staff. And we projected, as part of the evaluation of the proposals, that these projects, when implemented, will reduce about 11,500 metric tons of carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Now, some of our clean energy projects, that just get a feeling, we're doing 20 deep energy retrofits on Black-owned single-family homes. 5 of those we're going to put solar arrays on, with 2 of them with battery backup systems, which become increasingly relevant as we have rolling blackouts or power shutoffs or anything else that we certainly experienced this past year. 8 of the deep energy retrofits will happen on single-family affordable housing properties with majority Black residences, as well as conducting energy audits for 42 other properties, so we can go back and get at those in future rounds. We're funding a match savings fund and a curriculum development to support Black homeowner energy efficiency and solar PV investment. We're supporting residential ductless heat pump installation programs targeting 200 low-income homeowners, as well as deep retrofits for 15 to 20 BIPOC-owned homes in the Jade District, which is one of our most diverse districts, but certainly our district with a heavy Asian Pacific Islander population. A little more flavor on some of our green infrastructure projects. So it's more than those. We're also planting trees in a whole range of areas and engaging youth as part of workforce development. We're supporting gardening programs in schools, homes, as well as correctional institutes. We're supporting community gardening more broadly with a whole range of immigrant populations, and through those, connecting them to foods that feel a little bit more similar to where they come from, as well as investing in a few de-paving projects where we're removing pavement from the ground and installing green infrastructure. So we're both beautifying an area, addressing water, but also getting sequestering more carbon in soils. And then there's a handful of workforce development grants and 29 planning grants, which are going to hopefully seed projects for future rounds. All right, with that, just speaking to what's next, we're heavily onboarding we're busy onboarding our first round of grantees, and it's new for us as staff to be doing this, but also figuring out how we take institutions such as the city and think through all the various ways in which we evaluate risk and working through that and thinking about how we make this as smooth as possible for our grantees. We're working on thinking about how we support future applicants, as well as gearing up for our next RFP, which is going to be about $60 million. And we're launching a mini grants program, which is about $100,000 per quarter with $5,000 applications to support folks with smaller efforts. Building a small community garden box, hosting a community event focused on getting input around a project of community organization we want to do, other things like that. A whole range of just continued systems improvement, implementing our workforce and contractor equity standards, performance metrics and reporting outcomes, and many other things. So we're incredibly busy at work, and at the same end, I'll share that we're just always keeping a pulse on other jurisdictions maybe such as those nearby you all, but many other places that are in active conversations and saying, how did you all do that? How might we do something similar for our area? Recognizing that it's going to be an important step to have many jurisdictions implement similar programs, all with their local flavor and twist, and ultimately push the national, push at the federal level to have something similarly done. So I know that I hope that I saw some initial questions, so I'll stop there, but I think that really captures it. And I'll sit here unless I can always, depending on the questions, I might stop my screen share and allow people's faces to be bigger.
Thank you so much, Sam. Our audience is welcome to add any questions they might have in the Q&A or in the chat box. We'll keep an eye on it. It's such an exciting program. And as I mentioned to you sort of before we really started, is I have quite a few friends who live in Portland, and I was there for the heat dome. And it feels like more than 20% who don't have air conditioning. It definitely is a change coming to the city. So I'll kick it off with a question or two, and then sort of sort through some of the questions we had that came in with the pre-registration. You talked about the RFP, the request for proposals process, and you're clearly trying to reach an audience that might not have had access to this kind of process prior. So how are you actually reaching these communities that are maybe not used to submitting for RFPs or might need assistance in that RFP process?
It's a range of efforts, and I don't want to pretend that any one thing works and or that we figured it out. So I'll start with, as we early on, we have a staff of 12 folks, although early on, when I think that last RFP went out, we've grown substantially. We're at probably 6, and some of it involves just the heavy labor of a lot of one-on-one conversations. But I don't want to discount the fact that this program was born for and by the community. It was born from within the community, and it came to the city. And there's a healthy distrust of community of the city. It's a range of things the city has a long history of doing, and we don't expect that to go away. But it gave us the benefit of a greater level of trust because folks said, we designed this program, it's for us. And so we started at a good footing. So I just want to express that acknowledgement that this program has been a gift to the city, and I am fortunate to be able to be in this position, benefiting from a lot of that work that happened within the community and the many folks that we stand on the shoulders of previous before us. So it gives us a certain level of credibility as we started out, but it really started with continuing to, in all of our efforts through the development of our RFP, through the development of every single question, going out there and putting it out there and having conversations with folks. When we would go back and get feedback and something didn't work, we would say, okay, who are we going to get feedback from? And we would convene and we'd bring folks back and we'd say, okay, where did we miss the ball? Okay, let's make sure we're bringing back our organizations that are working with priority communities, because our first round of our application really spoke to white-led organizations, mainstream dominant, and that's what folks said. They said, when you design this feels like it was designed, you're asking questions of white-led organizations to prove how are they doing racial justice work. This doesn't feel like it's designed for us. And we heard that and we said, okay, we're going to adjust this. And so I think it's just been consistently making sure we're checking in with the communities that we've said this was meant for, and we have that continued work to do. One particular thing we did is right before we released the RFP, we asked for permission to put out about $200,000 in what we called application support grants. These are $5,000 increment grants, and we just put them out there, simple one-page application, simple 15-minute application. And it allowed us to get money into organizations' hands that were smaller, that might have had limited capacity to hire grant writers and things like that. So to start, we're continuing to build it out. And other things we do is we host, we host Q&A sessions with culturally specific groups that are bringing together, and we'll have translators there to say, okay, here's the RFP. We go through everything. We'll have interpreters there to talk through the content. So it's I guess it's a bunch of different things, and we still have more to do.
That's fantastic. So those first little small grants, they also might be used to help people get to the next level and apply for a bigger grant?
Absolutely. That was the intent. We knew that the questions we were asking, when we ask an organization about climate resiliency, it's a loaded term, and there's a lot there, and it's definitions and it's technical. And so we were, these are questions that are important, but we had to work through that. And so there's a lot of content we developed to explain things, but I don't want to discount that some folks saw our materials and said, all your explanatory stuff is a lot. And they were like, so it's just trying to meet people in several different avenues. And so we'd have that, but we had those grants so folks could have, support for their time to show up in some of our Q&A sessions and others.
That's great. We have a question from an audience member. Mike says, I love what you're doing here. You mentioned in your beta funding, you expect 11,000 tons of CO2 reductions. Is that a one-time total or annual reduction every year going forward? I also was wondering if you have a target in terms of dollars per ton CO2 reduction.
These are great questions. So to the first question, this is like, I think I went to your second question already. Can you repeat that first question again real quick?
Sure. So the first part of the question says, you mentioned in your beta funding, you expect 11,000 tons of CO2 reductions. Is that a one-time total, or is that what you're hoping to do each year?
It's lifetime basis. So it's a cumulative calculation that essentially we assume these projects have, depending on the measure itself, if it's solar panels, 25-year useful life. And so we'll project out those emissions reductions over the lifetime of whatever was being installed. And those are very much estimates. Once people get in their projects, they make adjustments, but that we did evaluate them based on those. And then getting to Linda, the second question around what was our dollar per greenhouse gas emissions reduced? This is like the question that comes up every time. And we push back pretty heavily on this question. It's something that we will get to. I don't want to discount that. It's something we'll get to. But right now, we have a deep history. We have a ton of expertise in investing in, $100,000 plus middle income households that own their homes. We know that. We know exactly what is the dollars per kilowatt hour, the dollars per therm, that's the most efficient target, and we know where we're, what the next level we need to go to. So we have that information really well rounded, but we have zero history, very little history, maybe let me acknowledge, of investing in communities that have not seen any investment over many years, that have not seen their homes improve, that have not benefited from getting equity, from living in certain communities, having the equity investments to reinvest into their assets. And so we recognize that means there's a lot of deferred maintenance that we will be investing in that other communities have had the historical benefit of getting as a result of whether it is residential energy efficiency tax credits, whether it's one means or another, which we can go through a heavy list of. So, which is just to say that we expect to get to that number pretty close, but just to give you a ballpark sense, we're investing in the realm of $30,000 to $50,000 in each household, in some of our households. So I just want to get that, and that's the level of investment it takes to make sure that these are healthy homes that are operating efficiently with lower bills for those residents. And so it's going to look different than traditional programs, and we're fine tuning what those numbers look like. But so I have more, and we can keep going there. But what we're taking is more of an adaptive management approach and a race to the top approach in terms of the proposals that get funded based on the outcomes they're proposing. So I'm happy to talk offline about this.
Along those same lines, clearly the range of things you're interested in investing in it's not all measurable by greenhouse gases, right? It's not all measurable by how we're switching energy production. It measures, like you said, the sort of equitable, rising the equitable level of investment. So I'm sort of wondering, I think about this question of measuring what matters all the time, because I find that there are lots of things that we don't measure that really do matter, like social cohesion, like the ability to age in place. And so you're going to have a lot of other side advantages that might not be quantitative. How would you say, if we extend this question a little bit, how are you thinking about measuring success overall of the program, and sort of what other ways are you measuring the impact that this fund might have?
Yeah, this is, because of the variety of the types of investments that we make, in terms of speaking to the overall performance, how we're doing reporting on that, it's going to be many different measures, particularly for the different areas. How many folks have we trained? But of those folks that we've trained, how many of them are women? How many of them are women of color? And how many of them not only get into the apprenticeship, but make it out 5 years later and are at the journey level? So it's many different metrics for the different areas of the program. It's not a simple story. I really want to be very clear. I think what I've taken an appreciation for is the complexity of the problems we have today require more complex solutions. And so it doesn't lend itself to the sound bites, and we will have many different sound bites. And a lot of what we'll be focusing on is certainly got a talented communications manager who's thinking about the storytelling and making sure that folks get a better sense for all the other things that play out within these projects. Because Linda, those are very real. To be able to make sure that just a handful of folks remain on their block means a big difference for the others on their block. And so, and yet I want to acknowledge that that's still something we're going to continue to figure out as we implement these projects and figure out how we tell that broader story. But there's going to be the basics. We're going to talk about greenhouse gas emissions reduced per dollar invested. We will talk about that, and we will also talk and make sure that that is not only paired with that, but that is paired with the other benefits. That we how many life, health, safety improvements did we make in these homes as well, and other things.
Is there a moment where you have to sort of come up before a board for renewal? You said that it's a lifelong investment and could potentially be voted out at some point. Hopefully not, but is there like a 5-year time span where you have to report back and say this is what we've accomplished in our first 5 rounds?
We come to the board every year and we report out on our progress. The nature of that reporting is going to just shift, and I think right now we're still early on, so a lot of what we're reporting on is the process. How many people engaged with us, and how did people feel in that process? What was, did they feel good, and did they feel welcomed, and who were those folks, and who felt welcomed or not welcomed? So that's a lot of what we're speaking to, and a lot of our evaluation is really focused on the process that folks have gone through as part of either providing input to what we developed or actually applying for grants and receiving those. So that's what we've spoken to, but many folks, and I'm excited, many folks are eager to see some of those outcomes, and we're just getting our first ones funded now. So I'm equally excited, and we'll continue to tell that story annually.
Great. So Mike had another question, and then I think we've got a couple more coming in. Do nonprofits have an avenue to work with city departments? For example, can they work with a city department on something like bioswales or something that might require agency input? Like, I'm thinking this is probably more in the green infrastructure realm, but it could also be in solar renewable energy.
No, you're very right. The first place we tend to go to is when we think about green infrastructure. A lot of that happens in the right of way, right? So it's that area between the sidewalk and the road, that planting strip that hopefully exists in a particular neighborhood. So it happens a lot in that space, and there's all sorts of permitting that's required because you're either dealing with the utility companies and their electric lines above, or the gas lines or the water things below, or there's a lot of interaction with agencies. Right now we're still, I think folks are still figuring out what that's going to look like. There is a path to working with city agencies, but city agencies and their capacity to work with community groups is not unlimited. And so those are some of the conversations we continue to expect to engage with. But because I think there's been a lot of community excitement for PSEF, we've fortunately had a lot of positive energy in working with other city agencies and their desires to be really supportive of our nonprofit organizations and the communities behind them, and in making sure that they're welcoming as well. So it's working with the city is never easy. One department manages something, another doesn't, and I know every region has those nuances, but there we do expect that work, and we've seen some of that.
And maybe this is
but we are not. Let me just be clear. But we are not direct. We facilitate where we can, but yeah.
But you are also
grantees will come to us having done that work.
You're part of the city. I mean, you're part of the Office of Sustainability and Planning, correct? I don't know that you mentioned that.
We are in the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, correct? And you're getting into like city governance, which is this weird. It's just we have a commission form of governance where I report to our bureau, and our bureau director reports to the commissioner, and the Water Bureau or the Parks Bureau may report to another commissioner. And so we try to facilitate those interactions, and we try to make sure that where there are things that can benefit all of our grantees, such as understanding permitting pathways or recognizing we're going to have a lot of new contractors learning about solar, we make sure that we'll work with our Bureau of Development Services to say, hey, what are you doing knowing that we see this? So as we think more programmatically, as we see programmatic needs within a certain other city agency, we do that work. But on an individual grantee basis, as it comes up, we'll engage, but otherwise we look to them to negotiate some of that too.
Great. So we have another question from Ryan. The slides reference targeted communities. How do you prioritize projects with different approaches? Is there a scoring aspect based upon level of impact for specific geographic areas or populations? And yeah, that kind of brings up the idea, like, are you making efforts to distribute these in any kind of way that is even across the different communities? Or yeah, maybe you want to answer. It's kind of a three-part. Is it about level of impact? Is it about specific geographic areas or certain populations, or a combination?
Level of impact matters. We want projects that are going in deep. I mean, surface level can happen too, and someone can propose that, and that'll be scored. Level of impact matters. I mean, our committee worked heavily, and they said we want to prioritize projects that are going in deep, not just giving a little bit, but going in deep and actually meaningfully impacting an individual household's outcomes. And so that has trade-offs, right, in terms of your ability to go wider. But that was, so level of impact of a particular project absolutely matters. And so some projects tend to do better than others, and we're still working through that and fine-tuning this. As far as geography, we went out with our first draft of our RFP before we released it. We said we wanted to prioritize East Portland, which is historically a part of the city that was annexed later into the city and has just had a lot less development. You know, it feels, and we can get into urban heat islands, in fact, just where even we had greater deaths as a result of the heat dome. And there's a couple of different parts of the city, but we prioritized that. And then we had a lot of feedback that we heard from organizations that said, you know what, Black community was here. They've moved here. By you prioritizing here, we're still working on bringing them back here, and we're still here. So we got a lot of different feedback. And I think where we ultimately landed was, you know, it's about the individual communities, not necessarily where they are. And we may revisit that. I suspect we will. It's not necessarily where they are, but it's about the particular communities and serving them where they are. And so I think right now we saw projects happening across the city, which is just reflective of where our communities are. But I know that that's not the case in every, you know, Portland is an interesting city in that we can get into its history, but both because of, you know, current displacement and gentrification trends, it isn't like some other places where you have a particular, you know, a Latinx community in this neighborhood, or you have a Black community in this neighborhood. And so we ultimately did not place a geographic focus, but we certainly track that just to see whether we need to over time.
You brought up gentrification, so I have to go there for a second because it's a real issue in Portland. Does that fit into your circle, your pie pieces in any way? Like, is helping people stay in their homes part of the a social sustainability question that might fit within your matrix, or no?
You're hitting on something that we've been digging into recently, and really trying to understand the frameworks or how we evaluate, you know, public investment in gentrification, and understanding the levels at which public investment may either result in more people coming into the neighborhood and displacing those we want to benefit versus actually providing services to that community that have long been neglected. So we're trying to understand that. Generally speaking, we think our projects support people remaining in their communities. So generally speaking, we're helping them either put more money in their pockets, fix up their homes so that they may not be forced to sell it, or their grandkids forced to sell it because, you know what, there's a lot of deferred maintenance and we can't do anything, let's just get rid of it. So we're hoping we're helping people by doing some of those sorts of investments, but also the job training, and just making sure that knowing that you know, having more income in your pocket is just a critical means to making sure you're able to stay in a place and afford a place. So I think generally, but we do know that there's probably a threshold of public investment in an area that draws people in from outside that neighborhood that probably starts to create that impact, and we're figuring out and teasing out what are our ways about thinking about that and evaluating that.
So Cassie wants to know what project or proposal you're most excited about. Is there one that you want to share with us in detail?
You know, I can't. That's like to pick my I couldn't. That's asking to pick my favorite child. There's phenomenal projects throughout there. I'm excited truly about all of them. I'd recommend, and I'm happy to, you know, that if you all go to the Portland Clean Energy Fund, the city website, not the coalition that led it on and got on the ballot, but if you go to the city website, you can see the projects and get a feel for them. There are tremendous projects out there. I mean, one project I'm just even, you know, there's a project called the Afro Village Project, and it's a project where this individual, Lakita Langford, who has been a community organizer for many years and done a lot of work within the Black community on a whole range of the housing, community gardening, environmentalism, and she won grants to take a disused or a formerly used rail car, right, on our light rail. When they retire them after 30, 40 years, they can give them up for use. And so she's taking those rail cars and repurposing them to be able to potentially either move around the city, stay stationary in a place, and actually provide services to homeless women of color and provide a place of reprieve. And it's going to be done. So it's a really cool project that's bringing together many things. And so that's one project, but otherwise that's just because it's cool. But I love the bread and butter stuff. I mean, you just get in the home, seal it up, get it efficient, put money back in people's homes, make it healthy. I'm equally happy with that. So
I've seen a lot of coverage of the urban agriculture projects in particular. Did you get a lot of applications in that sector?
We did. It's a sector that I will share hasn't historically been funded by grant funding. And so this is a pretty meaningful funding source. And we've had a lot of growth of our people of color farming, whether it's first foods and in the Native American community. We've had a lot of growth in first foods projects because we have a pretty significant urban indigenous population here. But we also had a lot of projects from the Black community focused on connecting with the land and growing food and distributing it to the community and healing through growing food. So there's some really exciting projects there too.
So we had a question that was submitted before the event started, and I want to ask it and then expand it a little bit. And the question originally said, do you think it is easier to do a program like this in a mid-sized city? And this is someone who currently works for the city of Los Angeles. So that's one question, does scale matter? Portland does feel kind of like a neighborhood-based city where there's a lot of people know each other. There's a lot of connection and history. And then my second part of this question would be, is it also easier in a city that has the kind of political will and political leanings that Portland has that are friendlier towards a sustainability agenda? And maybe both of those questions lead to a bigger question, which is, do you see this as exportable? And have you talked to other mayors or other city councils about maybe adopting this in their own cities? That's 5 parts.
Yeah. The mid-size. So I'm assuming when we say mid-size, we're talking about Portland mid-size, because I know LA is not mid-size. So let's
right. So that was the question. Does this mid-size effort, can it scale up to a city? I mean, that's 15 times larger, I think LA is, maybe if you go the whole county.
Yeah. There's no reason for me to believe that it couldn't. It really is find your funding source, but the mechanism itself and the ingenuity certainly exists within the community, and just knowing LA. So I think it is. I think it very much is exportable. I mean, there's certain constraints about real things that are impacting people's lives that are not going to be in the purview of a program like this, right? Like our streets and our highways that bisect communities and level a whole tremendous amount of pollution on certain communities. Psef isn't meant to do that, and those projects take billions of dollars, as we know, in times to address. And so I don't want to pretend that Psef is everything, but I think, yes, I think this certainly is exportable both to smaller and larger cities, recognizing what it can do, and some things that are absolutely the responsibility of whether it's the federal transportation department or state or local. So just want to understand what are the responsibilities. This is the funding mechanism isn't meant to eliminate responsibility of others. It's meant to create a community resource to address issues. In terms of the political will, this goes back to the coalition that created the initiative. And I didn't spend enough time there, but I had the fortune of maybe being around that table very early on, and then our first kiddo came along, and so I stepped back. But there was a tremendous amount of trust building that went on between environmental groups, between organizations that represented and worked with and served the communities of color, and then ultimately bridging that out and bringing others into the fold. And so there was a lot of just trust. I mean, it truly was 2.5 years of work to develop the coalition that made this ballot measure possible. And so when I think about whether this can happen in its exact form that it happened in Portland, maybe not. I suspect that you're going to need to tailor it to that local context. And I think it comes down to, folks coming together, developing trust and finding sort of that shared common goals, and whether that's making sure that folks have a living wage, which was critical to labor coming on board on the program, or whether that's about whether it's about planting trees. So I think the coalition building kit couldn't be understated, and even having our progressive businesses, our small business, Main Street businesses, all of those folks saying yes, we want this was really important. So I think that those sorts of ingredients, I think those exist anywhere. We've got workers, we've got people of color everywhere, we've got low income folks everywhere, we've got environmentalists, so we've got all those everywhere. So I think that those can come together.
We've got renewable energy needs everywhere. We've got job needs everywhere. Some pressing issues, right? Some pressing issues. So, and remind me, did I miss a part to that? So the last part that I asked was, are places talking to you about exporting your model and adapting it to their own cities? Like, have you been approached by other mayors or councils?
Yes, yes, and some of it's myself, some in our program, some of it is the coalition that made it, because I think in many regards, we weren't part of that, right? We've implemented the program once it became a city program. So yes, I know that there's a whole range of groups, coalitions, and others around the U.S. that have reached out, and we've gone and talked to, and a lot of that sometimes is the coalition, and that's a group that I'm happy to connect anyone with that organize and continue to be a watchdog, because despite the program being real, implementing, there's still always a tango. So yes, there are other jurisdictions that are reaching out. The city of Denver passed a very similar program, and we had certainly spoken to them, and I don't want to take any, by no means, I think, but they're worth looking at. They have a similar program as well. It's different in the way it's operated, little differences, but you look at it from the outside and it looks very similar. So we hope to see more of these certainly across U.S. cities, because we're trying to prove this out. Can we, it can't be an either or. Can we truly invest in climate action as well as racial and social justice at the same time? And I think that's something that many cities are interested in.
Well, I think they're inseparable, as your initiative implies, right? That these things, you have to work on all of these things together, because it's the impacts of climate change are just going to exacerbate the inequities we already have. And as you see in the 20% of houses that don't have air conditioning, right? I imagine that as you said, the many of those people are older adults, and many of those people are living alone, and many of those people are people of color. And this effort's got to fill some of those gaps. So we had another question. It moves a little bit off the particular incentive that you're working on, Psef, but someone was asking about how we might increase the diversity overall in the environmental community. And I know your initiative is, generated by people of color, led by people of color, in an effort to serve people of color and people in marginalized communities. So you've been embedded in that. Do you have independent thoughts on that question?
Yeah, and I will share, and my staff is predominantly people of color, and that's important, right? And so, it's a big one. And I mean, and I a lot of my early work, was actually convening and bringing people together in the environmental space as people of color to have a space for refuge. So a lot of my just early work in connecting with people before I did more traditional environmental justice oriented work I was just like, oh, you're another brown person in the environmental space, let's come together because this can be lonely. And so there are groups like Environmental Professionals of Color, which is a network, and it's a program of the Center for Diversity in the Environment. And so that's a space, and these are spaces where I've often tried to bring in people of color to say, you need a support network if you're doing this work. But as we talk about, it's really all the other, I'd say when we think about diversifying the environmental space, it's the same conversations that are playing out elsewhere when we're talking about of diversifying workspaces. And that's a bigger conversation that I feel like I have insights into, but I would just say, start looking at just diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, and best practices and guides that exist, because it's once you go down that road, you recognize it's a lifelong journey for organizations to figure out how to reflect the communities they want to serve. And so that's I'll leave it there. And many resources, and I wish I had a few off the top of my head. Greening, is it greenlining? There's a group based out of the Midwest that actually does a lot of reports on environmental diversity. It's called Green 2.0 or Green. I find it. Someone wants to reach out and give me, I'll send out, but there's a handful of resources, and I'm sure that network itself can point you to places and consultants and folks that can help you.
Fabulous. Yeah, if you identify those, I'm sure we can share it with the audience. So we're going to wrap up, and I wanted to just say how much I am excited to hear about this program, how impressed I am with the program's agility to adapt to the needs of the people you're serving. I mean, I know as a government affiliated agency how hard that can be, but it's really an impressive effort overall. And I wanted to read just this one little quote because I saw that video of Van Jones talking about the initiative when it was up for a vote. And you get a good quote from Van Jones. I think you have to share it. And he said, you take 1% from the 1% and use it to help the 100%. That is beautiful. That is brilliant. So thank you so much for sharing everything you've shared with us today, your insights into the program, your willingness to be here and talk to our alumni, parents, and friends. We really appreciate your time. I don't know if you want to share the website of Psef, where people can go and learn more about the projects. I think maybe that would be of interest.
I will do that. Go ahead.
Okay, no, and that'd be great. I'd love to see more of the projects too. I think we just want to wrap up and say thank everyone for listening in and being a part of the conversation and posing great questions, for your interest in this topic. For those of you who are in St. Louis, we hope you stay connected with our Alumni and Alumni Association. This was recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel if you want to watch it again or if you want to share it with friends. I'm happy to continue a conversation afterwards if people want to email me and talk about sustainability in St. Louis, or I will be in LA for the coming year. For those of you who are in LA, I'll be talking about sustainability in LA. Your work is amazing. I love that WashU produces such a diversity of people out in the world doing fantastic work. So last note from our alumni folks, we encourage everyone to join our WashU Sustainability Network LinkedIn group if you want to carry on this conversation there too. And we hope you'll continue to participate in the future with conversations like this. So thank you all for attending. Thanks, Sam. So great to meet you. And I hope next time I'm in Portland, it's not 107 degrees.
Thank you, Linda. And thank you all for having me. Really appreciate it.